The mist parts, revealing a wooden prow cutting through the North Atlantic waves. 30 men strain at the oars, their faces weathered by salt and wind. The year is approximately 1000 CE, and these Norse explorers are about to make landfall on a continent that European maps have not yet recorded. Standing at the helm is Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, peering at the approaching shoreline of what the Norse will come to call Vinland, a land that would one day be known as North America. This moment, occurring nearly 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus's famous voyage of 1492, would remain largely forgotten by the wider world for almost a millennium. As the longship's keel scrapes the pebbly shore, these men become the first Europeans to step foot on American soil, an achievement that would be lost to most of history until modern archaeology confirmed what Norse sagas had claimed for centuries. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now let's begin. To understand this remarkable achievement, we must first understand the world from which these Norse explorers emerged. The late 8th century in Scandinavia was a time of significant change. The region was experiencing population growth that strained its limited agricultural resources. The arable land was scarce, confined mostly to coastal areas and river valleys, while vast forests and mountains dominated the interior. Local chieftains competed for power and prestige in societies where wealth and martial prowess determined one's place in the social hierarchy. Alliances were formed and broken through marriages, gift-giving, and occasionally violence. Climate patterns were shifting, making farming increasingly difficult in the northernmost settlements. Winters grew longer and more severe, shortening growing seasons and threatening harvests. To the south and east lay the wealth of Europe and beyond, prosperous Christian kingdoms, rich monasteries, and established trade networks stretching from the British Isles to Baghdad. These lands represented opportunity for ambitious Norsemen seeking wealth, land, and glory. Life in Scandinavia followed the rhythm of the seasons. Summer months saw intense agricultural activity, fishing expeditions, and trading voyages to distant lands. Winter brought communities together in longhouses where stories were shared, crafts were practiced, and plans were made for the coming year. The long, dark nights of winter were illuminated by hearth fires, around which skalds, poet-historians, recited tales of gods and heroes, keeping cultural memory alive through generations. Despite the harshness of their environment, archaeological evidence reveals a society with remarkable artistic sophistication, producing intricate metalwork, wood carvings, and textiles that demonstrate both technical skill and aesthetic sensibility. Their material culture reflected their values, celebrating strength, courage, and the interconnected relationship between humans, nature, and the divine. The people we now call Vikings originated from what is today Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, lands of dramatic fjords, dense forests, and long, harsh winters. Their society was organized around family units and local assemblies called things, where free men could speak and influence decisions. These gatherings served as courts, parliaments, and forums for dispute resolution. While chieftains and eventually kings held considerable power, the Norse political system contained elements of democracy and respected the rights of free men to participate in governance. They lived in longhouses built of timber, with central hearths that provided warmth during the brutal northern winters. These buildings housed not just nuclear families, but often extended kin groups and dependents. Archaeological excavations have revealed longhouses ranging from modest farmsteads to impressive halls belonging to chieftains, some measuring over 80 meters in length. Their religious worldview was populated by gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, deities who embodied the forces of war, thunder, and fertility that shaped their lives. Odin, the one-eyed Allfather, was associated with wisdom, poetry, and the fury of battle. Thor, with his mighty hammer Mjolnir, protected humanity from chaotic forces and ensured fertility of the land. Freya governed love, beauty, and destiny. Unlike the more abstract monotheistic faiths developing elsewhere in Europe, Norse religion was intimately connected to the natural world and daily life. Sacred places included groves, mountains, and bodies of water, rather than elaborate temples. Rituals marked the turning of seasons, important life transitions, and community events. The Norse cosmos was conceived as a great ash tree, Yggdrasil, connecting 9 worlds inhabited by gods, giants, elves, dwarves, and humans. This complex mythology explained the origins of the universe, outlined ethical principles, and promised an afterlife that valued courage above all else, with the greatest warriors joining Odin in Valhalla to prepare for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of time. These were pragmatic people, skilled farmers and fishermen who supplemented their diets by hunting and foraging. Contrary to their warlike reputation, most Norse spent their days tending fields, managing livestock, or practicing specialized crafts. Archaeological evidence shows they cultivated barley, rye, and oats, kept cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, and harvested the sea's bounty with nets and lines. They understood the delicate balance of northern agriculture, using techniques like crop rotation and fertilization to maintain soil fertility. Their diet was more diverse than often portrayed, including dairy products, preserved meats, bread, porridge, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and herbs. Communal work efforts, particularly during harvest time, strengthened social bonds. They valued independence, courage, and reputation above all else. The concept of honor, maintaining one's good name and standing within the community, guided social interactions. Reputation could be enhanced through generosity, wisdom, martial prowess, and keeping one's word. The fear of shame and the desire for a legacy that would outlive them motivated many Norse actions, including their most ambitious voyages. The Norse possessed technological innovations that would ultimately enable their Atlantic crossing. Chief among these was the Longship, perhaps the most sophisticated naval vessel of its time. These ships represented a revolutionary design, with shallow drafts that allowed navigation in both deep seas and shallow rivers, flexible hulls that could withstand the pounding of ocean waves, and a combination of sail and oar power that provided remarkable versatility. The distinctive dragon or serpent heads adorning many prows served both to intimidate enemies and as spiritual protection for the crew. The keel was typically made from a single oak trunk with overlapping wooden planks, clinker-built, forming the hull. The flexibility of this construction allowed the ship to twist slightly with the waves, rather than fighting against them, distributing stress and preventing catastrophic failure in rough seas. Wooden pegs and iron rivets held the structure together, while oakum, twisted fibers soaked in pine tar, sealed the seams between planks. A large square sail made of woven wool provided primary propulsion when winds were favorable, while oars allowed progress during calm conditions or precise maneuvering in coastal waters. These vessels were not merely transportation. They were expressions of power, wealth, and craftsmanship. The ship was so central to Norse culture that it featured prominently in their art, literature, and burial practices. Ship burials at Oseberg and Gokstadju in Norway demonstrate how the vessel could serve as both a conveyance to the afterlife and a status symbol, interred with elaborate grave goods to accompany prominent individuals into the next world. Equally important to their seafaring success was their mastery of navigation techniques. Without compasses or sextants, Norse sailors relied on intimate knowledge of natural signs, the position of the sun and stars, the behavior of birds and marine life, the color and movement of water, and the patterns of prevailing winds. They developed a sophisticated understanding of North Atlantic weather systems and currents. In the absence of maps as we know them, they created mental geographies based on sailing directions, landmarks, and estimated travel times between locations. Sailing instructions preserved in texts like the Norwegian King's Mirror describe routes by noting features visible from the sea and the relative positions of celestial bodies. Archaeological evidence suggests they may have used primitive sunstones, crystals of Iceland spar that polarize light, to determine the sun's position even on cloudy days. These navigational skills were passed down through generations of sailors, creating a body of practical knowledge that enabled increasingly ambitious voyages. Their expertise extended beyond shipbuilding and navigation to include a sophisticated understanding of woodworking, metalworking, and textile production. Norse craftsmen created tools perfectly adapted to their environment, axes designed specifically for shipbuilding, ice spikes for winter travel, specialized fishing implements. Their ironworking technology produced weapons and tools of remarkable quality, with pattern-welded swords representing the height of their metallurgical achievement. Women's textile work was equally advanced, with warp-weighted looms producing wool cloth of varying weights and qualities, including the sailcloth essential for maritime ventures. The archaeological record reveals a material culture that combined practicality with aesthetic sophistication. Everyday objects often bearing intricate decoration and symbolism from their rich mythological tradition. The Viking Age began in earnest with raids on coastal targets, but what initially drove these Northmen to look westward toward the distant horizon? Several factors converged to create this expansionary impulse. Climate improvements around the 8th century had led to population growth that the limited arable land of Scandinavia could not sustain. Generations of farming had depleted soil fertility in some regions, while others simply lacked sufficient agricultural potential to support growing communities. Inheritance customs meant that only the eldest son would inherit the family farm, leaving younger sons to seek their fortunes elsewhere. This practice, designed to prevent the fragmentation of agricultural land into unsustainable parcels, created a class of ambitious young men with martial training, but no inheritance, a volatile combination that contributed to overseas expansion. Political centralization under ambitious kings drove opponents to seek independence abroad. As rulers like Harald Fairhair in Norway sought to consolidate power, formerly independent chieftains and their followers sometimes chose exile over submission, establishing new settlements in previously uninhabited or sparsely populated lands. And perhaps most fundamentally, the Norse culture celebrated exploration and the accumulation of wealth through raid and trade. Their oral traditions preserved tales of ancestral migrations and legendary voyages, creating a cultural template for exploration. The sea was not a barrier but a highway, a route to opportunity that beckoned adventurous men. Archaeological evidence from pre-Viking periods shows that Scandinavians had already developed extensive maritime networks throughout the Baltic region, laying the foundations for more ambitious ventures. Their initial raiding activities, which shocked Christian Europe with attacks on monasteries like Lindisfarne in 793 CE, demonstrated the effectiveness of their naval technology and tactical approach. Success bred imitation, as wealth flowing back to Scandinavia inspired others to seek similar opportunities. What began as seasonal raiding gradually evolved into more permanent presence abroad, with winter bases eventually becoming settlements and colonies. The first major westward expansion took the Norse to the British Isles, Iceland, and eventually Greenland. Their initial presence in Britain and Ireland was characterized by raiding and temporary settlement, but gradually evolved into permanent colonies and political control in regions like Dublin, York, and parts of Scotland. These areas became important nodes in expanding Norse networks, providing bases for further exploration and settlement. Iceland, discovered in the 9th century, became a significant Norse colony with its own unique political system, the Althing, one of the world's oldest parliamentary institutions. The initial settlement period, described in sources like the Book of Settlements, Landnámabók, saw a rapid influx of Norse immigrants claiming land around the island's coastal regions. By 930 CE, most arable land had been claimed, and a distinctive Icelandic identity was beginning to emerge, one that preserved Norse cultural elements while adapting to new environmental conditions. The absence of native populations meant colonization occurred without the conflict that characterized Norse expansion elsewhere, though competition among settlers occasionally led to violence. By the late 10th century, Eric the Red had established the first European settlements in Greenland. Exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, Eric explored Greenland's southwestern coast and recognized its potential for settlement despite the challenging environment. His promotional efforts, including the somewhat misleading name Greenland, or an island largely covered by ice, attracted several hundred settlers who established two main colonies, the eastern settlement near modern Qaqortoq and the smaller western settlement near present-day Nuuk. These communities survived by adapting Norse agricultural practices to Arctic conditions, supplementing farming with hunting marine mammals, and trading valuable products like walrus ivory, polar bear pelts, and live falcons to European markets. The Greenland colonies represented a remarkable feat of adaptation, surviving for approximately 500 years in one of the world's most challenging environments. These stepping stones across the North Atlantic would ultimately position the Norse at the threshold of a new continent. The sagas tell us that it was Bjarni Herjolfsson who first sighted North American shores around 985 CE, when his ship was blown off course while attempting to reach Greenland from Iceland. He did not land, but reported seeing forested coastlines unlike the more barren Greenland. The saga account of Bjarni's accidental discovery illustrates the combination of accident and design that characterized Norse exploration. Attempting to join his father, who had relocated to Greenland, Bjarni encountered fog and northerly winds that blew his ship off course. Rather than landing on the unfamiliar shores he sighted, Bjarni chose to correct his course and continue to Greenland. His decision reflects the pragmatic nature of Norse voyaging. His primary goal was reaching his destination, not exploring unknown lands. However, his reports of forested coastlines sparked interest among the Greenland settlers, who recognized the potential value of timber resources for their wood-poor colony. In the cramped quarters of the Greenland settlements, where news of Bjarni's sighting would have spread quickly, the prospect of unexplored lands to the west must have generated considerable excitement and speculation. It would be Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, who would make the first documented European landing on North American soil around the year 1000 CE. According to the sagas, Leif purchased Bjarni's ship and assembled a crew of 35 men to investigate the lands Bjarni had sighted. The Norse Vinland sagas, the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, describe how Leif's expedition first encountered a rocky, barren land they called Helluland, likely Baffin Island, then a flat, wooded region they named Markland, probably Labrador, and finally a verdant area with wild grapes or berries that they called Vinland, from the Old Norse vin, which could mean either wine or pasture. Here they established a small settlement and spent the winter before returning to Greenland. The saga accounts provide vivid details of this momentous voyage, though scholars debate which elements represent historical fact versus literary embellishment. Both texts describe Leif finding the wreckage of a ship and rescuing its crew, earning him the nickname Leif the Lucky. They recount the discovery of wild grapes or berries that inspired the name Vinland, though botanical evidence suggests true grapes would not have grown as far north as Newfoundland, leading scholars to suggest alternative translations of vin as meadow or pasture. The sagas describe the construction of large houses for the winter stay, the abundance of salmon in nearby rivers, and the fact that there was no frost in winter, and the grass hardly withered. This last detail suggests either a particularly mild winter, an unusually southern location, or saga exaggeration. Most striking is Leif's methodical approach, systematically exploring and naming the lands he encountered, assessing their resources, and establishing a base from which further exploration could proceed. His expedition demonstrates the Norse capacity for planned, purposeful exploration rather than mere accidental discovery. The landscape the Norse encountered in North America differed dramatically from their Greenlandic and Icelandic settlements. Newfoundland offered dense forests of pine, spruce, and birch, valuable resources for a people whose homes in Greenland suffered from acute timber shortages. The waters teemed with cod, salmon, and other fish species, while the land supported diverse wildlife unfamiliar to European eyes. Archaeological evidence from Los Meadows reveals that the Norse harvested butternuts during their stay, a species that doesn't grow north of New Brunswick, suggesting they explored considerably further south than their known settlement. For men accustomed to the treeless expanses of Iceland and the ice-dominated landscape of Greenland, the verdant forests of North America must have appeared as lands of extraordinary abundance and opportunity. The meeting of these two worlds, Norse and indigenous North American, represents one of history's most remarkable cultural encounters. The Norse encountered people they called Skraelings, most likely ancestors of the modern Inuit in the northern regions, and possibly Mi'kmaq or Beothuk peoples farther south. These encounters ranged from cautious trade to violent conflict. The sagas describe how the indigenous peoples approached in skin boats, exchanging furs for dairy products and red cloth. The Norse noted the physical appearance of these people, describing them as small, ugly men with threatening features and tangled hair on their heads. Such unflattering descriptions reveal more about Norse cultural biases than about the indigenous people themselves, demonstrating how cultural differences shaped perceptions on both sides. Initial interactions appear to have been characterized by mutual curiosity and tentative trade. The sagas describe the indigenous people's particular interest in dairy products, which would have been unknown to populations without domesticated cattle, and in red cloth, which held special significance in many Native American cultures. The Norse, for their part, valued the furs and pelts offered by the indigenous traders. However, this tentative relationship soon broke down, but cultural misunderstandings and the inherent tensions of competing territorial claims led to confrontations. In one account, the Norse captured and killed 8 Skraelings, prompting a larger retaliatory attack that forced the Norse to retreat. One saga describes how a bull belonging to the Norse broke loose and charged toward the indigenous camp, causing panic and suspicion of treachery. Another account tells of a Skraeling attempting to take Norse weapons, resulting in his death and subsequent retaliation by his people. These violent encounters reveal the challenge of cross-cultural contact in the pre-modern world. Without shared language or cultural reference points, misunderstandings easily escalated to violence. The vast technological and cultural gap between these peoples meant that meaningful communication and understanding were limited at best. The Norse, accustomed to dealing with Europeans who shared broadly similar cultural backgrounds, despite linguistic differences, were ill-equipped to navigate the profoundly different worldview of indigenous North Americans. The indigenous peoples, likewise, had no framework for understanding these strange newcomers, with their metal tools, woven cloth, and unfamiliar animals. That any peaceful exchange occurred at all is remarkable, given these challenges. The archaeological evidence at Los Meadows provides tantalizing glimpses of this encounter, though direct evidence of indigenous Norse interaction remains limited. The site has yielded few artifacts of definitive indigenous origin, suggesting that substantial contact may have occurred elsewhere, perhaps during exploratory voyages south of the main settlement. What evidence does exist suggests that relations deteriorated over time, with later encounters being predominantly hostile. The Norse, despite their martial culture and technological advantages like iron weapons, found themselves outnumbered and operating far from their support bases. Indigenous knowledge of the local terrain provided tactical advantages that offset Norse military technology. The immediate aftermath of these first encounters did not lead to permanent European settlement. Despite several follow-up expeditions, including one led by Leif's brother Thorvald, and a more ambitious colonization attempt by Thorfinn Karlsefni, with approximately 60 settlers, the Norse presence in North America remained temporary. The sagas describe how the hostility of the indigenous peoples, the challenges of maintaining supply lines across the dangerous North Atlantic, and the limited resources available to the small Greenland colonies ultimately made sustained settlement untenable. Thorvald's expedition ended with his death from an arrow wound during a skirmish with indigenous people, highlighting the dangers faced by the Norse in this unfamiliar territory. Thorfinn Karlsefni's attempt at more permanent settlement included women and livestock, clear indicators of colonization intent rather than mere exploration. According to the sagas, this expedition resulted in the first European birth in the Americas, when Karlsefni's wife Gudrid gave birth to a son named Snorri. The family eventually returned to Iceland, where their descendants included several important bishops, a genealogical detail that may have helped preserve these stories within medieval Icelandic tradition. Karlsefni's expedition reportedly lasted 3 years, the longest Norse presence in North America documented in the sagas. Its ultimate failure stemmed from a combination of factors: continued hostile relations with indigenous peoples, internal disagreements among the Norse themselves, and the logistical challenges of maintaining a remote settlement. The Norse withdrew from Vinland, likely within a decade or two of their arrival, though occasional voyages to collect timber for Markland may have continued for some time afterward. The sagas mention several other voyages, including a tragic expedition led by Freydis, the half-sister of Leif Erikson, which ended in violence among the Norse themselves. According to this account, Freydis orchestrated the murder of a rival group of settlers and personally killed 5 women with an axe when her male companions refused to harm them. Whether this story represents historical fact or saga sensationalism remains debated, but it illustrates the interpersonal tensions that could arise in small, isolated colonial ventures. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Norse abandoned Lens aux Meadows by about 1020 CE, bringing the first chapter of European presence in North America to a close. The reasons for abandonment were likely multiple. The site may have been intended as a temporary winter camp or way station rather than a permanent settlement. The small Greenland colonies lacked the population and resources to sustain distant outposts, and indigenous resistance made the cost of maintaining settlements too high compared to the benefits. These momentous events were recorded in the Norse sagas, written down centuries after they occurred. The saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders, compiled in Iceland during the 13th and 14th centuries, preserved accounts of these voyages through generations of oral tradition before finally being committed to parchment. These sources present challenges to historians, blending factual accounts with literary conventions and mythological elements. Saga tradition valued both historical accuracy and narrative engagement, creating texts that occupy a middle ground between history and literature. Some details contradict each other, and embellishments likely crept in during centuries of retelling. Different versions of the same events appear in the 2 main saga accounts, with characters playing different roles and events occurring in different sequences. The saga of Eric the Red gives prominence to Leif Erikson, while the saga of the Greenlanders emphasizes Bjarni Herjolfsson's initial discovery and Thorfinn Karlsefni's colonization attempt. These textual inconsistencies reflect the nature of oral tradition and the saga writing process. Stories were transmitted through generations of oral recitation with skalds, poet-historians, adding literary flourishes while attempting to maintain the core historical narrative. When finally committed to parchment in the 13th century, these tales had passed through numerous retellings, each potentially introducing variations. The saga writers themselves worked within literary conventions, that valued dramatic narrative and character development alongside historical reporting. Yet these texts remained the primary evidence of Norse exploration of North America until the 20th century, when archaeology would finally confirm what the sagas had claimed. The relative accuracy of the saga accounts, despite their textual challenges, is remarkable. They preserved core geographical information, the sequence of lands encountered, their basic characteristics, and approximate sailing times between them, with sufficient accuracy that modern archaeologists could use them as guides in locating Norse sites. They recorded practical details of daily life, construction techniques, and resource utilization that archaeological evidence has largely confirmed. Most importantly, they preserved the memory of an achievement that might otherwise have been entirely lost to history, the first European encounter with North America centuries before Columbus. Other documentary evidence provides tantalizing glimpses of Norse activity in North America. Adam of Bremen, a German chronicler writing around 1075 CE, reported a conversation with the Danish king Sven Estridsson, who described an island in that ocean discovered by many, which is called Vinland, for the reason that vines producing excellent wine grow wild there. This independent confirmation, recorded much closer to the events than the later sagas, suggests knowledge of Vinland had reached European courts by the late 11th century. Icelandic annals record additional voyages, including a 1121 CE journey by Bishop Erik Gnupsson to seek Vinland, and a 1347 CE account of a small ship blown off course from Markland to Iceland. These scattered references suggest occasional contact may have continued for centuries, though apparently without resulting in permanent settlement. The Norse continued to maintain settlements in Greenland for approximately 500 years, though these colonies remained small and vulnerable. At their peak, perhaps 2,000 to 4,000 people lived in two main settlements, the eastern and western settlements. Archaeological excavations have uncovered the remains of approximately 280 farms, 16 churches, and one monastery, revealing a society that maintained many elements of European culture despite their isolation. They built churches, traded walrus ivory and polar bear pelts with Europe, and attempted to adapt their agricultural practices to the harsh Greenlandic environment. The construction of substantial stone churches, including one at Vejlsø, whose ruins still stand today, demonstrates their commitment to Christianity and their desire to maintain cultural connections with Europe. Excavations have uncovered European luxuries like bronze church bells, stained glass, and fine textiles, indicating ongoing trade connections despite their remote location. These Greenland colonies represented the outer edge of medieval European civilization, a tenuous foothold in an environment that constantly challenged human adaptation. Their survival for 5 centuries is a remarkable testament to Norse resilience and adaptability. Archaeological evidence shows how they modified their agricultural practices, focusing on pastoral production over crop cultivation in the short growing season, and supplemented their diet with seal hunting and other wild resources. Recent isotope analysis of human remains indicates that their diet shifted over time, with marine resources comprising an increasing proportion of their nutrition as the climate cooled during the Little Ice Age. This adaptive strategy allowed them to survive in an environment where conventional European agriculture would have failed. But they faced mounting challenges. Cooling climate conditions during the Little Ice Age made farming increasingly difficult, as growing seasons shortened and sea ice expanded, limiting navigation and communication with Europe. Declining demand for walrus ivory reduced their trading power, as elephant ivory from Africa became more available in European markets. The economic foundation of the colonies weakened as both agricultural productivity and trade value diminished. Their small population made them vulnerable to disease and conflict. Archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that the Norse Greenlanders maintained a relatively small, isolated population that would have been vulnerable to epidemic disease, though no specific evidence of such an epidemic has been found. Some scholars have suggested conflict with Inuit peoples may have contributed to the colony's decline, though evidence of large-scale violence is limited. By the mid-15th century, around the time Columbus was born, the last Norse Greenlanders had either perished or abandoned their settlements. The abandonment of the Greenland colonies remains one of medieval history's most intriguing mysteries. The last documented contact between Greenland and Europe was a wedding at Valsey Church in 1408, recorded in Icelandic annals. After this, the documentary record falls silent, and archaeological evidence suggests gradual abandonment rather than sudden catastrophe. No mass graves have been found, and many valuable items appear to have been removed from settlements, suggesting planned departure rather than disaster. Where did the last Greenlanders go? Some may have returned to Iceland or Norway, while others may have perished during attempts to leave. The possibility that some integrated with Inuit communities remains speculative, but cannot be ruled out. Whatever their ultimate fate, the end of Norse Greenland severed the connection between Europe and North America until Columbus's voyage nearly a century later. The Viking Age itself was drawing to a close. The same forces that had driven Norse expansion, political fragmentation, population pressure, and cultural emphasis on raiding, were giving way to new realities. Scandinavia was being integrated into medieval Christian Europe. The conversion to Christianity, largely complete by the 11th century, brought Scandinavian kingdoms into the broader European cultural and political sphere. Kings consolidated power, supplanting the old chieftain system. Monarchs like Knut the Great, who ruled a North Sea empire encompassing Denmark, Norway, England, and parts of Sweden in the early 11th century, and later rulers like Magnus the Good and Harald Hardrada, established more centralized authority with support from the Church. The conversion to Christianity altered cultural values and relations with neighbors. Christian ethics emphasized peace and forgiveness over the vengeance and honor that had characterized Norse society, though this transformation was gradual and incomplete. Trade replaced raiding as the primary economic activity, with permanent markets and towns developing throughout Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence from trading centers like Hedeby, Birka, and Kopang shows increasing specialization of crafts and expansion of commercial networks. The distinctive Norse identity that had propelled men across the Atlantic was gradually transformed into the more recognizable kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. By the time Columbus set sail in 1492, the great age of Norse exploration had been over for centuries, and their North American discovery had faded into legend even in Scandinavia. Yet traces of this history remained. In Norway and Iceland, the sagas preserved memories of Vinland voyages, though increasingly seen as legendary rather than historical. European cartography occasionally included tantalizing references to lands west of Greenland, though with diminishing accuracy as the actual voyages receded into the past. A 1570 map by Abraham Ortelius shows a Whitland near Greenland, possibly a corruption of Vinland. The Danish cartographer Claudius Clavis, working in the 1420s, reportedly included western lands on his now-lost maps. Norse geographical knowledge, preserved in fragments and increasingly distorted through centuries of transmission, may have influenced later European conceptions of Atlantic geography, though the extent of this influence remains debated. What are we to make of this remarkable chapter in human history? The Norse exploration of North America represents one of history's great what-if moments. Had their settlements in Vinland endured, had communication with the indigenous peoples developed differently, had sustained contact between Europe and North America been established 5 centuries earlier than it ultimately was, how might world history have unfolded differently? We can only speculate. Perhaps gradual cultural exchange, rather than sudden conquest, might have characterized European Native American relations. Perhaps Norse colonies might have expanded slowly, integrating with local populations rather than displacing them. Perhaps diseases might have spread more gradually, allowing indigenous immune systems to adapt rather than causing devastating population collapse. Or perhaps the outcome would have been equally tragic, merely happening earlier and in slower motion. The Norse achievement remains extraordinary. Using technology no more advanced than wood, iron, wool cloth, and their hard-won knowledge of winds and currents, they crossed one of the world's most dangerous stretches of ocean and reached a continent unknown to their contemporaries. They did so not once but repeatedly, establishing the first known European settlement in North America and maintaining knowledge of these western lands for generations. Their accomplishment was not mere accident, but the culmination of a systematic process of Western exploration that had already taken them to the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. Each step westward built on previous knowledge and experience, creating a maritime cultural adaptation uniquely suited to North Atlantic exploration. For centuries, these Norse voyages remained largely forgotten outside of Iceland, where the sagas preserved their memory. Even there, they were often viewed as legends rather than historical accounts. Columbus and later European explorers had no knowledge of these earlier voyages when they set sail across the Atlantic. Renaissance Europe looked to classical sources and Eastern routes, rather than Northern traditions for geographical inspiration. When Columbus made his famous voyage in 1492, he carried with him Ptolemy's geography and Marco Polo's travels, not Norse sagas. His conceptual framework was entirely Mediterranean, envisioning a westward route to Asia rather than a new continent. Had he known of Norse voyages, his expectations and preparations might have been quite different. It was not until 1837 that the Danish scholar Carl Christian Rafn brought serious academic attention to the possibility of pre-Columbian Norse voyages to North America with his book Antiquitates Americanae. Even then, his work was met with skepticism by many historians who considered the saga accounts too legendary to be reliable historical sources. Supposed Norse artifacts discovered in the eastern United States, like the Newport Tower in Rhode Island and the Kensington Runestone in Minnesota, later proved to be misidentifications or hoaxes, further discrediting the concept of pre-Columbian Norse presence. It was not until 1960 that definitive archaeological evidence of Norse presence in North America was uncovered by Norwegian archaeologists Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. The excavations revealed the remains of 8 buildings, including a forge where iron nails had been produced to repair ships. Radiocarbon dating confirmed occupation around 1000 CE, precisely matching the time frame described in the sagas. The Lonso Meadows site transformed our understanding of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact, moving the Norse voyages from the realm of legend to confirmed historical fact. The settlement consisted of 8 buildings constructed in typical Norse style, wooden frames with turf walls providing insulation. 3 large halls contained living quarters with central hearths, sleeping platforms along the walls, and separate rooms that may have served specialized functions. 5 smaller structures appear to have been workshops or outbuildings. Archaeological evidence indicates that the site housed between 70–90 people temporarily and was occupied for between 3 to 10 years. Artifacts recovered include a bronze pin used for fastening cloaks, a soapstone spindle whorl for spinning thread, a bone needle, and numerous iron boat nails and rivets. Evidence of metalworking, carpentry, and boat repair suggests the site served as a base for exploration and resource extraction rather than permanent colonization. In the years since, additional evidence has emerged. Norse artifacts have been identified at indigenous sites across the Arctic, suggesting more extensive contact than previously recognized. Fragmentary pieces of copper and bronze of European origin have been found at Native American sites in the Canadian Arctic, suggesting trade networks may have connected Norse Greenland with indigenous populations across a wider area than previously thought. A potential second Norse site was identified at Point Rosie, Newfoundland, though further investigation has called these findings into question. Initial excavations in 2015 revealed what appeared to be a hearth and evidence of bog iron processing, but subsequent work failed to confirm these features as definitively Norse in origin. Researchers have employed new technologies to identify potential Norse sites, using satellite imagery to locate promising locations and advanced dating methods to authenticate findings. The study of Norse exploration of North America remains an active field, with new discoveries still possible. Genetic studies have sought evidence of biological mixing between Norse and indigenous populations, though results remain inconclusive. A 2010 study claimed to have identified genetic markers suggesting prehistoric European ancestry among certain indigenous groups in the eastern Canadian Arctic, but subsequent research has questioned these findings. Archaeological evidence from the Dorset and Thule archaeological sites in the Canadian Arctic reveals increasing European influence after 1000 CE, including copper items and evidence of new manufacturing techniques. This material evidence suggests cultural contact, though its extent and nature remain subjects of ongoing research. Recent climate studies have shed new light on the environmental conditions faced by Norse explorers. Analysis of tree rings, ice cores, and ocean sediments indicates that the period of Norse exploration coincided with a significant warming trend known as the medieval warm period, approximately 950 to 1250 CE. This climatic optimum would have improved sailing conditions in the North Atlantic, with reduced sea ice, more predictable weather patterns, and longer growing seasons in northern lands. These favorable conditions likely facilitated the westward expansion of Norse settlement and exploration. The subsequent onset of the Little Ice Age, approximately 1300–1850 CE, brought harsher conditions that may have contributed to the abandonment of the Greenland colonies and the cessation of North American voyages. Today, this history has taken on new significance in our understanding of global connections and human migration. The Norse voyages to North America remind us that the history of human exploration is more complex and interconnected than simpler narratives suggest. They challenge the traditional framing of 1492 as the definitive moment of contact between Europe and the Americas, revealing a longer, more nuanced history of transatlantic connection. They demonstrate that technological sophistication is relative. The Norse achieved with wooden ships and iron tools what later explorers would accomplish with more advanced technology. They challenge us to recognize the remarkable capabilities of pre-modern peoples who accomplished feats of navigation and adaptation that would be challenging even with modern technology. The brief Norse presence in North America also offers sobering lessons about the fragility of human settlement and the challenges of cross-cultural contact. Despite their maritime prowess, technological advantages, and cultural adaptability, the Norse could not establish permanent settlements in North America. Their failure stemmed from a complex interplay of factors: limited population resources, logistical challenges of transatlantic support, cultural isolation, and conflict with indigenous peoples. This history reminds us that successful colonization depends not merely on technological advantage, but on numerous interconnected geographical, demographic, cultural, and political factors. It suggests that the later European colonization of the Americas succeeded not because Europeans were inherently superior, but because specific historical conditions, including disease, political fragmentation among indigenous peoples, and larger population resources, created opportunities that did not exist during the Norse period. The legacy of the Norse in North America is subtle but persistent. Place names like Markland and Vinland have vanished from common usage, replaced by Labrador and Newfoundland. No Norse buildings remain standing. No Norse colonies survived to influence later European settlement. Yet their achievement lives on, in the archaeological remains at Los Olmedos, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and popular tourist destination, in the continuing scholarly investigation of their voyages, and in the cultural memory of what they accomplished. In both Scandinavia and North America, this history has become part of regional identity and pride. Norway, Iceland, and Canada have particularly embraced this shared heritage with monuments like the Leif Erikson statue in Reykjavik and cultural events commemorating these historic connections. For the descendants of those indigenous peoples who encountered the Norse, this history has different implications. It represents an early chapter in a much longer and often tragic story of European contact. While the Norse impact was minimal compared to post-Columbian colonization, these encounters foreshadowed the profound disruptions that would follow centuries later. The Norse experience demonstrates that the challenges of cross-cultural contact, miscommunication, competition for resources, and violence have deep historical roots. Indigenous oral traditions from regions where Norse contact occurred may preserve memories of these early encounters, though identifying such traditions with certainty remains challenging given the centuries that have passed and the absence of written records from indigenous perspectives. Contemporary scholarship increasingly seeks to incorporate indigenous perspectives and knowledge systems into understanding this history. Archaeological investigations now routinely involve consultation with indigenous communities whose ancestors may have encountered the Norse. Scientific analysis of indigenous sites contemporary with Norse settlement helps balance the historical record, providing insights into how these communities may have perceived and responded to European arrivals. This more inclusive approach recognizes that the story of Norse exploration cannot be told solely from European sources, but must incorporate the experiences and perspectives of all participants in this historical encounter. The story of Norse exploration of North America also offers broader insights into the nature of human migration and cultural contact. Throughout human history, groups have moved into new territories, encountering existing populations and negotiating complex relationships ranging from cooperation to conflict. The Norse voyages represent one chapter in this longer human story of migration, adaptation, and cultural encounter. Their experience reminds us that such encounters rarely follow simple patterns of conquest and submission, but involve complex negotiations of power, knowledge, and resources on both sides. It suggests that human migration has always been driven by multiple factors: environmental change, population pressure, political conflict, economic opportunity, and cultural values, interacting in complex ways. As we gaze across the Atlantic today, the distance between Europe and North America seems trivial, a matter of hours by air, a routine journey that thousands make daily. We easily forget how vast and terrifying that same ocean appeared 1,000 years ago, when Leif Erikson and his crew set sail from Greenland with only their courage, their ship, and their sailing knowledge to guide them. They could not know that they were making history, could not anticipate that a millennium later we would still be telling their story and marveling at what they achieved. For them, the journey was both practical and personal, a search for resources, an adventure, perhaps a chance for the fame that Norse culture so highly valued. Yet their individual actions, recorded in saga and confirmed by archaeology, have become part of our collective human story. In the end, perhaps the most significant aspect of the Norse exploration of North America is not that it happened first, before Columbus, before the Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French colonial powers, but that it happened at all. It stands as testimony to the human drive to explore, to venture beyond known horizons, to seek new lands and opportunities. The Norse crossed the Atlantic because it was there, because their culture valued the bold venture and the well-told tale that would follow. They reached America not by accident, but through a systematic process of exploration that had already taken them to Iceland and Greenland. Their achievement reminds us that history rarely follows the neat, linear narratives we construct in retrospect. It is messier, more complex, filled with false starts and forgotten chapters. The Norse voyages to America represent one such chapter, a beginning that did not immediately continue, a discovery that had to be made again centuries later. What might they have thought, those Norse explorers, if they could have glimpsed the future importance of the continent they briefly touched? Would they have recognized the significance of their achievement, or would they have seen it merely as one voyage among many, one adventure in lives filled with bold undertakings? We cannot know, but we can recognize that when Leif Erikson and his men stepped onto the shores of Vinland, they were not merely discovering a new land, they were writing the opening lines of a new chapter in human history, one whose full significance would not become apparent for centuries to come. As we reflect on this remarkable story, we are reminded of the common humanity that connects us across time and culture. The Norse sailors who navigated the treacherous North Atlantic were motivated by recognizable human desires for resources, for land, for adventure, for a better life. The indigenous peoples who encountered these strange visitors responded with equally recognizable emotions: curiosity, caution, fear, and defense of their territories. The challenges they faced in understanding each other across profound cultural differences mirror challenges we still face today in our increasingly interconnected world. Their story is our story, one thread in the complex tapestry of human history that continues to unfold. As the seasons turn and we look back across the span of 1,000 years, the Norse voyages to North America remind us of humanity's enduring qualities: curiosity, courage, adaptability, and the drive to venture beyond known boundaries. These same qualities would eventually lead other Europeans across the same ocean, with far more profound and lasting consequences for both the peoples and landscapes of the Americas. The Norse were first, but they were part of a longer human story, one that continues to unfold even now, as we seek to understand our shared past and navigate our collective future. In a world where borders and boundaries often divide us, the story of the Norse voyages reminds us that human connection and mobility have always been essential aspects of our collective experience. Whether by longship or spacecraft, humans continue to explore, to discover, and to encounter one another across the divisions of geography and culture. End of historical narrative. Cinematic historical photograph, late 8th to 9th century, Northern Europe. Shot at natural eye level, documentary composition, no posing. Realistic cinematic lighting, cold daylight or overcast tones, sharp human expressions, tactile details, wool, fur, leather, wood, metal. Authentic northern atmosphere, period-accurate clothing and architecture. 16:9 ratio crisp realism, as if captured by a historical photographer on location. A Norse longship making landfall on the shores of North America. Crew members wading through shallow water, carrying supplies, while their leader stands on the beach, gazing at the dense forest beyond. Several indigenous people watch cautiously from the tree line. The low afternoon sun creates long shadows across the rocky beach strewn with seaweed.